The 2021-22 season has concluded for the Chicago Bulls, and with its conclusion comes with it a lot of reflection, analysis, as well as plans and decisions for the future. And for the Bulls, this was an up and down season to say the least, with a lot of highs in finally being a winning team again, a team that was, at least for the first half of the season, exciting to watch. And of course, the Bulls made the playoffs for the first time in 5 years and finished with a record above 500 for the first time since 2015. But then, of course, there were the lows. The Bulls finishing off the season winning just 7 of their last 22 games, going from the number 1 seed in the East all the way to the 6th seed. And the Bulls looked noticeably different as a team after the All-Star break, even when they finally started getting players back like Alex Caruso, Zach Lavine, and Patrick Williams. There was something about the way this Bulls team looked that didn't sit well with a lot of Bulls fans, including myself. So in today's video, we're going to be talking about what went wrong in this season for the Bulls to try and understand the drastic shift in performance from the start of the season, and then discuss what needs to be done in the offseason to remediate some of these issues. So what's going on, everyone? You're listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. Now, as I'm sure most of you know, I recently welcomed the birth of my second child, another daughter, into the world, and I mentioned on my socials as well as the community tab here on YouTube that I will be uploading less frequently than you're used to seeing, as my family will always be my #1 priority, even as much as I love basketball. So appreciate you all for understanding during this time in my life, and hope you'll continue tuning into the channel even with less frequent uploads. But I'll still try and get content out there for you guys when I can, because I still love doing this kind of thing, and in the little free time that I have, I figured, why not? Let's talk basketball. So anyway, back into the content. So I think most fans would agree the season overall was a disappointment. And I'll add context because I do think it's important to note where the Bulls used to be not that long ago compared to where they are now. And the fact that the matter is, if you told me at the beginning of the season the Bulls would finish the year with 46 wins and 6 in the East to make the playoffs, I would have said, that's pretty solid. That's way better than what the Bulls have been for the better part of half a decade. But at the same time, and this is what sports will do to you, no matter what kind of expectation you had going into the season, if those expectations are exceeded, you then change your expectations and set a new bar and higher standard. And that's exactly what the Bulls did. They came into the season with a lot of question marks. Sure, they added some great talent by getting Lonzo Ball and DeMar DeRozan, a great role player in Alex Caruso, but most people, and I mean most people outside of Bulls fandom anyway, didn't really think that much of this Bulls team. Sure, an improved team, but you still had people questioning if they'll even make the playoffs. You still had people questioning the fit on the team, particularly Zach Lavine and DeMar DeRozan. And I don't think anybody, again, non-Bulls fans saw this anyway, anybody thought that the Bulls were actually title contenders, which even a lot of Bulls fans, realistic Bulls fans, didn't see the Bulls as title contenders, including myself, which I had a lot of people give me a hard time for. So the expectations weren't really that high for the Bulls going into the season. And then right out of the gate, the Bulls looked like an incredible basketball team that fit perfectly together, that was clicking on both ends of the floor, that looked like a group of guys who had been playing together for years despite all the new faces to the roster. You had DeMar DeRozan playing at an MVP level with his high-level scoring on insane efficiency. Zach Lavine was playing with more poise and confidence than we had seen in years past. Lonzo Ball proved to be a perfect complement to this Bulls team with his playmaking and defense. And then you even saw guys like Javonte Green and Dosunmu stepping up in big ways when it was thought that they might not even get a ton of playing time. Like at one point in the season, the Bulls were 26-10 after going on a 9-game winning streak. And this was even with the big COVID outbreak that plagued the league, in which guys were in and out of the lineup. The Bulls were playing some of the best basketball in the NBA and doing so on some of the best offensive and defensive ratings in the league. And quite frankly, the Bulls were riding so high with so much confidence that if someone did proclaim this to be a true title contending team, you really couldn't say they were all that off. The Bulls were looking that good. So the Bulls set off this season with very high expectations based on how everything was flowing together, based on how guys were stepping up and performing at a high level, and also just based on the fact that the Bulls were sitting at the top of the Eastern Conference all the way into February, just 2 months outside of the playoffs. And as a fan, your perception of the team completely changes. You see this as a team that is one of the best basketball teams in the league, and then of course, the All-Star break hit. The Bulls' schedule got a little harder. Lonzo Ball's return kept getting pushed out further and further and was eventually shut down for the season. The Bulls' season started spiraling out of control. Now, There are a number of factors, circumstances, theories as to what happened with the Bulls, ranging from injuries, scheduling, coaching, etc. The list goes on. And yes, to an extent, I think all of these things played a factor in the sudden decline in their season, but really, I think the main thing that boils down to why this team fell apart, again, among these other factors, which I'll touch on briefly, and that was the heart and toughness of this team. Like, if we're being real with ourselves, this team wasn't that tough. A hard-nosed team that had the ability to fight through adversity, that was not the Chicago Bulls. It was there some of the time, like you saw in certain games where the Bulls were either behind big in a game and came back to win, or then they had a big lead that they blew late in the game but pushed through to come away with a win, and you saw a lot of that at the beginning of the season. But that's just the thing. It's a long NBA season, 82 games. And to have the mental and physical fortitude to withstand that toll that it takes on you throughout the 82-game season to be great and give effort on a nightly basis, and also knowing when to step on the gas and maybe to take your foot off at times. It's a long season. It is a marathon, not a sprint. That's what great teams do. That's what contending teams do, is know how to withstand the mental and physical toll an 82-game season will have on you. The fact of the matter is, towards the end of the year, including the playoffs after those first 2 games anyway, the Bulls looked like they were completely gassed. They looked like they didn't want it more than their opponent. They got their heads down when things weren't going their way, and when they found themselves in a rut, they didn't know how to dig themselves out. The effort and energy, the toughness to push through even when all odds were against them wasn't there. And quite frankly, this team was pretty soft. And for longer time Bulls fans who got so used to the D-Rose era with the likes of Joakim Noah, Taj Gibson, Luol Deng, of course Rose, Jimmy Butler, even Carlos Boozer, as much as Bulls fans got annoyed with him, these guys were competitors. They fought night in and night out and gave it 100%. Not saying all of the current Bulls players aren't competitors at this level, but more often than not, you don't seem to have that competitive spirit and attitude. And that even goes for some of the Bulls' best players, super talented and skilled, but when push comes to shove and things aren't going their way, they get frustrated and start spiraling, either complaining incessantly to the refs, or they lose their way on the court and start forcing things to get back into rhythm. So yes, injuries were an issue. Yes, there is something to be said about coaching. Yes, their early stage success likely wasn't sustainable for the whole season, but the bottom line for why this team crumbled at the end of the year came down to a lack of heart and toughness from this team. Now, aside from that, what else led to the collapse of this team? Well, one thing is clear, losing Lonzo Ball was a big factor. And really a bigger factor than I think most people are going to give him credit for, especially when you look at the collapse in the Bulls' defense. But Lonzo alone wasn't saving this team. Like, I don't buy the narrative that had Lonzo Ball been healthy all season, the Bulls would have finished top 3 in the East and would have resulted in a deep playoff run. No, there were broader issues with this crew that one player alone wasn't completely turning around. But, like I said, when you look at the Bulls' massive defensive woes, especially perimeter defense, yes, having Lonzo Ball would have been a massive help. When you look at the floor spacing, Lonzo helps in that regard because he was actually the Bulls' best three-point shooter before getting injured, by percentage anyway. When you look at their overall pace and transition buckets, Lonzo was a big factor there as well. And of course, we can't forget all the time that Alex Caruso missed after he broke his wrist. Like, that's a huge shot to the Bulls defense that for a long time was top 10 in the league and fell off after these guys went down. Then, of course, there's the roster construction, which a lot of people were harping on as the main culprit for why this Bulls team wasn't as good as initially anticipated, was because of the roster and their limited size and front court, and the fact that your 3 best players are all great scorers, but none of them are good defenders. All 3 of them are the most impactful and lethal on offense when the ball is in their hands. Kind of a problem when there's only one basketball. But even that, while yes, I agree the fit on this roster maybe wasn't the best, and as talented as Zach and DeMar are, you could see the issues that could come down over time as it relates to their defense and their similar play styles on offense. But that still doesn't explain why they look so great together at the beginning of the season. Sure, having Lonzo and Caruso complement their lack of defense helps, but I don't buy the narrative that DeMar and Zach don't fit well together. They looked like one of the best duos in basketball to start the season. Of course, there was also the injury to Zach Lavine, which he even admitted himself he's not 100%, which I'm sure played a factor in how they played together, because now you had to rely on DeMar more than Zach. But even with Zach's injury, like, the injury itself doesn't affect his decision-making on the court. And there were just a lot of times at the end of the season where Zach just wasn't playing smart basketball. Even if you're not playing at 100%, you can still impact the game in a number of different ways from an IQ standpoint. And then finally, and honestly, this is probably The other biggest factor as to why this team fell apart late in the season, aside from the heart and toughness I first mentioned, and that's the fact that the Bulls became a little too predictable over the course of the season. Like, to start the year, it was a new roster, a new dynamic, but over the season, teams began to figure the Bulls out and made the necessary adjustments to be successful in beating them. And that's on coaching, because as opposing teams started making adjustments to counter the Bulls offense, Billy Donovan and the Bulls coaching staff didn't make the necessary adjustments to counter those changes and switch things up a bit to keep them guessing, rather than having a standard game plan and scouting report when teams were coming in to face the Bulls. The Bulls relied way too much on DeMar DeRozan and just setting up a screen and spot up mid-range jumper for him. Teams knew that if you could double DeMar effectively, especially with Zach not being 100% and Vuce being inconsistent all season, you're likely going to beat the Bulls. And then on defense, it was so abundantly clear that the Bulls were terrible at defending the pick and roll, really all season. Guys were not effective in following through screens and staying with their man for either a lob or a pocket pass. Again, because DeMar, Zach, and Vucevic are not known for their defense, especially their off-ball defense, and teams just attacked the Bulls over and over with the pick and roll and pick and pop plays. Some of the best pick and roll teams feasted going up against the Bulls, taking advantage of that weakness. Again, another area that is also on coaching. Yes, some of it is on the roster personnel, like what did you think was going to happen when you have a team centered around your big three players who aren't that great on defense, but there is no excuse for how the Bulls looked most of the season when trying to defend the pick and roll. How is that not something you're working on countlessly in practice when you realize teams are picking up on the fact that you can't play a lick of pick and roll defense and maybe try and do something about that? Again, not being so predictable as a team. On top of that, the fact that the Bulls really didn't prioritize size at all this past offseason and even at the trade deadline. I mean, the Bulls moved on from Tice, Thaddeus Young, both solid defensive bigs, Lauri Markkanen also gone. And again, I'm not saying these were necessarily bad moves because Thad was included in the DeRozan sign and trade. Markkanen was likely gone anyway, and you still managed to get a first-round pick for him. And then Tice, that's a guy I really wanted the Bulls to keep, but also knew salary-wise that likely wasn't going to be able to work on this team. But with all of those departures, that really left you with Vucevic, Tony Bradley, and Patrick Williams as your front court players. I know that we're moving more and more to positionless basketball and teams are going small across the board, but there is something to be said about having some semblance of size and depth, especially when you run into a situation where your only power forward gets injured and misses most of the season. So yes, some of it can be attributed to the moves made by the front office. Anyway, at the end of the day, the Bulls season, which started out so promising, completely fell apart. That being said, this was still a better Bulls team than we have seen in years, and it's still something they can continue to build upon with the pieces that they have. I do think this is going to be a very interesting offseason for the Bulls with a lot of questions and issues that need to be addressed, as even though this was a better Bulls team than we've seen in a while, there is no way that you're going to run this team back based on what you saw from the group down the stretch. Because even when fully healthy, the roster as currently constructed, talented, yes, and fun to watch, yes, a good team is not a contending team. I will have a video out on what the Bulls could potentially do this offseason and what I think they should do. I'll also put out some content on which players I expect to return and who will be on the move, as well as potential trade scenarios that could be played around with. I'll also keep you guys updated on any trade rumors that may come about, so make sure you're still tuning into the channel, even though the uploads may not be as frequent. Be sure to subscribe, and as always guys, thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next one.